Computer. Okay, cool. We are good. Hi, Ellie.
Hi, thanks everyone for being here. So I did just want to start by kind of setting the scene. What's the main goal behind my three-paper dissertation? Then I'll really briefly go through paper one outline because that's kind of less important for today. And same thing with paper two. And mostly I'm looking for feedback on kind of materials and methods for paper three, which I hope to kind of build from the first two papers. But I'm still kind of working through some important decisions about reading materials and types of questions and coding schemes. So I will start with kind of the really big picture problem is this epistemically fraught information ecosystem, this idea that a lot of work is put on individuals to kind of find reliable information, to reduce their own filter bubbles, because we are really living in an algorithmically curated system that's goal is to promote engagement and not so much truth. So one way to kind of help with that problem, besides regulating technology companies, which is outside of my area of expertise, is to try to develop these critical reading and thinking skills for students to find, understand, and evaluate diverse sources, which is also a very big task. So to start with, some reading and thinking skills. These are really common ones: setting goals, asking questions, making inferences and connections, and monitoring comprehension and resolving confusion. There's a big literature that suggests these are important reading strategies. And what's, I think, related to all of these is this concept of sourcing. And so sourcing is broadly has to do with considering the context behind a text, who wrote it, when, for what purposes. And I think it's actually related to all of these strategies. So, for example, you might set a goal to understand an author's motives, and you might question whether those motives are benevolent or perhaps malicious. And then you might have to make inferences from the text to try to understand a source's trustworthiness or expertise. And all the while, you're kind of monitoring to what extent you're reaching that original goal and what kind of additional sources then you may need to resolve confusion or find alternative perspectives. So I chose to focus on sourcing because it draws on many of those foundational comprehension and learning strategies, but also because a large body of research has shown that it's pretty useful for improving search selection and reading phases throughout online inquiry, as well as across readers of different ages with different kinds of tasks and topics. But one sub-problem to kind of that main problem of improving critical reading and thinking skills is researchers and educators have tried to intervene in sourcing and found that students don't generally apply it to their reading context. And so even when they're prompted, oftentimes like less than half of the participants are actually showing evidence that they've engaged in sourcing. And I would add that it's another problem is it's kind of a broad or fuzzy term. So when we look at the original definitions of sourcing, evaluating historical documents, look first to the source or attribution, paying close attention, considering, these are all pretty vague verbs, like what does it mean to evaluate or to pay close attention? And even though author is specifically noted as a source of information, there's not really additional details about what else counts as a source feature. So the documents model framework came out shortly after those original definitions, and it does provide some pretty explicit ideas of source features, namely author, including their name, their status, their motives, the setting, and they also include the form, that's language, style, and type or genre. And they also include rhetorical goals, which I think has been less focused on in discourse processing and sourcing literature. But the important thing is they at least give us a starting point for here's some explicit source features that researchers can look at. And so we see the impact of the multiple documents framework in these kind of newer definitions of sourcing from 2013, 2019, 2024, where now attention to, representing, and evaluating are included, particularly representing, but also predicting and interpreting, and then adding in kind of trustworthiness and publisher stuff. So definitions, they're getting a little more specific and concrete, but I still think they're very broad and oftentimes feel more like a serialization of a bunch of cognitive processes. Like attention is very different than evaluating and encoding or representing. And so the extent to which like it's really helpful to have all of these together, I think should be looked at further. So for paper one, I kind of approached it as we might need to solve problem two by like really coming up with a better, more precise definition of sourcing and its dimensions before we can try to get to problem one. So that's what I tried to do in paper one. I asked these kind of research questions, focusing on student process data. So what are the main dimensions or sub-strategies of sourcing? And my own research interests, I like to work with high school and college students. So that's why I focused on them for this systematic scoping review. And so I pulled out the constructed responses that have been used to measure sourcing before and kind of did a thematic analysis of those. And I won't go into the methods in detail here because that's not the main thing that I'm looking at for you all, but it's just context for paper two and paper three. And so what I found was you can kind of split sourcing definitions and measures into ones that are more about deliberate source evaluation strategies and others that are more about kind of fundamental document model integration processes. And so things kind of highlighted in blue are what seem to map more onto the source evaluation dimensions, whereas things in that kind of salmon color map more to the document model approach to sourcing. And notably, the source salience emerged as an important difference. So a lot of the research has kind of looked at explicit cues, those source node tags, like author, occupation, and whether they have a PhD or not. But there's actually evidence that readers used like word choice and like the kind of valence of word choice to infer source attributes. And so I called these more inferential cues, kind of based on that content and rhetorical goals nodes.
Real quick, I have a quick question
Mhm.
just to clarify. Are the salmon color under inferential and explicit cues like mapped from the document model integration dimensions? Cool, cool.
Yeah, which I think I have as the next one. Yeah, so I'll zoom in a little bit. So I kind of mapped that depth of processing towards sourcing to the documents model framework. So if I'm zooming in, are you also seeing that oh, that's too zoomed in. Are you also seeing that I zoom in?
Yes.
So with kind of a heuristic evaluation, and those seem to map onto the explicit source cues, they take things like author status or occupation and use that to kind of infer intent or expertise. But it's really kind of based, there's not a lot of connections to the content, and the connection is going from source to the content. So the example here was I saw the article was written by a professor, which means it is reliable. I'll zoom back up a little bit. But then there's this example. If they, the authors of the website, are getting very figurative with their language, then that strikes me as they're doing the most they can to expose emotions out of people, whoever reading it. And so this seemed to be, focusing on these like form kind of aspects, and notably of not just the situation model, but also these kind of lower parts of the document model, service code and propositional text base, to then make inferences about intent. And so that seemed to be a kind of more critical analytic approach, and they're inferring source motivation from the actual text itself. And presumably to understand persuasive intent, because I don't have any additional information about this, I don't know what that reader then went on to do with this inference, but their main kind of epistemic goals seem to be at first to just understand what the writers were trying to do here. And so that seemed to be a more in-depth kind of processing because it's making more of these connections in the documents model framework than this one that's just noticing an external cue, using that to evaluate whether they should trust the information in the document or not. And so main takeaways, I think there's an important distinction we need to make between the underlying cognitive processes that the multiple documents framework really stresses, or the documents model framework, and then these more deliberate evaluation strategies. And there's also oftentimes those deliberate strategies are focused on a single text at a time and not so much integrating across multiple texts. So it might also be helpful to even look at critical reading strategies in a single text and see how they apply to multiple texts. But I will just note that this work, and I still am working on answering research question number 2 now to kind of inform my next papers. It's very preliminary. It's based on a narrow sample of research articles and even more narrow sample of student data. So basically, I looked at the coding schemes and the example of like student think alouds to get some access to student data without having to do like a full on meta-analysis of qualitative data, because that's just too much for one graduate student trying to graduate to do. And the other thing I'll note is a lot of the materials still used pre-established document sets, and so they weren't looking at how readers engage in the search and selection processes either. So that's partly what I want to start doing as I think about papers 2 and 3. So the other kind of literature that is related to sourcing is source credibility, and that does kind of break down credibility or reliability of sources into these dimensions: expertise, trustworthiness. Trustworthiness is also sometimes divided further into integrity, like whether you follow kind of ethical norms and standards, and then benevolence, like how well-intentioned you are. But the expertise and trustworthiness dimensions seem to get a lot of the focus. And so I am wondering now, where do the author perspective and those motives for writing kind of fit into this source credibility framework? So in some respects, they kind of fall along with trustworthiness, but in other respects, maybe they're related to expertise. I don't know. It's kind of an open question. And so I'm trying to figure out some more of that mapping with paper 2. And so I think these kinds of source evaluations, they're important. That's the difference between disinformation versus misinformation is the intent to mislead. And they also represent pragmatic inferences, which I think have gotten a lot less attention in discourse processing compared to like bridging and elaborations. But there is some evidence that these kinds of evaluations of an author's perspective or motives are adaptive and can be beneficial for kind of critical thinking, especially online. But previous measures seldom measure these directly. So what I found was like when I was pulling out these author perspective and persuasive intent, they were coded as just like author evaluations under previous research. And so I think that larger grain size misses some important nuance because even within author and even within author expertise and trustworthiness, we're not getting at how readers are making these kinds of author perspective and motivation inferences. And even with general reading process or strategy kind of codes, so people who aren't measuring sourcing or source evaluation, but they're just measuring reading comprehension strategies. As I mentioned earlier, I think sourcing is related to these, but when we just use monitoring, paraphrasing, bridging, elaborating, predicting and stuff, we're not really capturing the relationships to sourcing here. So for paper 2, my goal is to use some of the adapted coding schemes that I identified in my scoping review and specifically focus on the source perspective, position, and motives and apply it to a new Think Aloud data set. And then that data set's already been collected and examined using comprehension monitoring, elaborating, and bridging. So I want to kind of map how these sourcing measures relate to the general reading comprehension strategies. So a little about the secondary data analysis. So these were the codes that I identified from existing literature: position, perspective, motivation. Um, and I still am, full disclosure, waiting for official confirmation to be able to use this. I have a backup data set that's pretty similar, but I'm hoping that this one will work. And so their original study used these 4 texts on climate change. Um, they're generally about a page long, written for undergrads or high schoolers. And they read the 4 texts. They're randomly assigned, though, to one of 3 conditions that collected these think alouds or constructed responses. So some of the students were asked to self-explain the readings as they went through them. Other students were asked to evaluate the source while they read these texts. And then a third was their active control think aloud to just report their thoughts. And these authors had kind of cued typing intentionally chosen at different parts of the text that might support bridging or elaborations. They also collected individual difference variables of general reading comprehension, science domain knowledge, and then climate change topic knowledge. And then these were their comprehension outcomes. So 4 measures that they ended up combining into one latent comprehension variable. Looks like the analyses came out pretty similar when they used them separately as opposed to one latent. So I'm going to go with their latent variable here. But sentence verification task, which just kind of gave them a sentence, and then it's like, did this show up in any of the readings or not? So just their surface level content memory. The intratextual inferences were making inferences within a source, intertextual being between the sources, and then finally a source content memory test. So not only can you recognize that this content came from the document set, but can you choose which document it came from? And then they coded their constructed responses for comprehension monitoring, paraphrasing, bridging, elaboration, source presence, source evaluation, and intertextual elaboration. And so, as I kind of alluded to for the secondary analysis, I want to take these codes from a previous Think Aloud that looked at source position and source perspective and so source motivation, and kind of recode the constructed response data here. And so originally blinded, and then kind of rerun their original analyses to see if these specific kinds of source evaluations are related to comprehension. Because notably, they didn't find, basically the only strategy in the original research that was related to comprehension was comprehension monitoring. All the other strategies, including source evaluation, didn't predict comprehension outcomes. And so I want to see if, first of all, if there's kind of a relationship between these types of source evaluations and overall comprehension, and then unblind and kind of look at, okay, are these types of evaluations being used for comprehension monitoring? Are they being used for elaboration? Or were these all also coded as kind of source evaluations in that original case? So just a reminder there. Okay, and paper 3. So I intentionally went through that quickly because paper 3 is what I'm working on right now and want the most kind of input on. But I will stop if just really briefly to drink water and ask if there's any like questions or comments so far.
The visual you made, sorry, my brain's like all over the place right now. There's a visual you made, I think, for sourcing and like the connections between different aspects of sourcing. Really love that. That's all.
Oh, so
That's all
that's
so far.
documents model connections or
Yeah, the connections one.
uh, I felt kind of proud of that. Also, this is really text heavy because I basically took my written outline and applied it to slides before this talk. So apologies that there's not more fun visuals.
No worries.
Just had like a quick clarification question about paper two, because you said like did you recode the coding scheme of that paper, or did you also code the think alouds, or both, or either one?
So I haven't done this analysis yet, but what I want to do is so the original study, they coded the think alouds, well, the think alouds self-explanations, source evaluations for these. I don't know if you see my mouse when I do this.
Yeah.
Um, okay. So they coded for these types of reading strategies. And what I want to do is recode their data specifically for these reading strategies, these source evaluations, when people refer to the source stance, except for it's regarding climate change, not desalination. Um, when readers refer to the kind of disciplinary perspective of the source, um, and then when they refer to the potential of financial or vested interests and that kind of thing.
Oh, so you're like trying to recode the original constructed responses and
Yeah,
then do correlation with their data, or
they're latent.
oh, the outcome measures. Okay. Gotcha, gotcha.
So basically taking a closer look at a measure of source evaluation that kind of accounts for these things where they seem to be important for like critically evaluating texts, but they're not generally measured directly. And so I want to really zoom in on those types of strategies and then see how they might map onto the original coding scheme. So that's kind of like the research question two for paper two. Um, does that clarify for you, Miranda?
Yes, yeah, thank you.
And then these were texts on climate change. And so that's kind of like a political topic, but it's also a scientific topic. And oftentimes with university students, it's a topic that matters to them, um, but they may not, but the extent to which they've directly experienced it can vary. So for paper three, still coding for those same things, source position, perspective, and motives. But now I want to also try to link these to the text features themselves. So the other issue with doing a secondary analysis of think aloud data is I get all of the think alouds, but I don't have them mapped to what part in the text the readers were like previously looking at when they made those thoughts. And so to be able to look at really specifically, okay, are readers using text features or linguistic cues to make these kind of evaluations requires some new data collection where I can make that mapping. Um, so that's why I'm doing this more in-depth case study approach instead of collecting a lot of data, just focusing on like 6 or 8 students. Um, and so part of the decisions that I have to make is like, how often am I going to prompt their think alouds? And like, am I going to a priori identify text features and then put the cues or the prompts to think aloud after those features? Or do I not have any cues and just only prompt them after like they've been silent for 2 minutes? yeah, so those are some of the things that I kind of wanted to talk through with everyone, and also thinking about um, additional data to help contextualize and get more at the kind of existing task goals or like epistemic aims the readers are bringing to the task. And I think it's too much to like capture their searching data. So I think I'd like to also just ask some questions like after they're done reading, you know, what would you, oh, well, I have, yeah. Do you want to know anything else about this topic? If so, what would you do next? Those kind of questions. But so these are kind of initial ideas for before they read. And then after they read, I'd like to ask a couple follow-up questions. But importantly, so the topic that I want to do is Operation Metro Search because it's impacted a lot of students, and I think it's a topic that they would like read about in their own time. And so yeah, so it seems really relevant. And I have a couple of, so one of these was like an educational kind of perspective.
Well, real quick,
Um,
can you go over what is Operation Metro Surge? I've heard about it, but I don't know anything about it.
oh yeah, so that was the Department of Homeland Security coming to Minneapolis to enforce immigration.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
And so we saw an uptick in like ICE officers and DHS officers. And so, a lot of the events going on in the Twin Cities in the last like month and a half related to immigration enforcement would fall under that Operation Metro Search.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so it's a heavy topic, but relevant. And I also like that it's not specifically like socioscientific. It's starting to get more into like sociopolitical topics, which I think people have stayed away from because of their controversy, and you want to control for that. But I think we're at the point where we can start trying to take on more of those complexities. Um, and so, yeah. So first question is, I don't know what readings exactly to choose. I do want them to like all be kind of different angles on this topic. Um, so I have like as a third idea, maybe a transcript of a Christy Nome speech or a press conference release. So yeah, this is my first thought where I would very much welcome feedback or ideas about reading materials. Oh, and for additional context, I'm doing this with university students. So they will be my reading audience.
You might have already said it, but did you in your like the draft survey, did you also plan to like include their like political beliefs or like kind of like their reading habits, like, oh, what is your like go-to like maybe like regarding this like particular topic or just like in general, like what kind of like sources like do you like what is your like go-to like media outlet or something like that?
Thank you so much, Miranda. I'm trying to find my notebook so that I can write that down.
So political views and typical sources of news.
Yeah, like kind of like maybe doing maybe it's not a
Yeah.
norming study, but kind of just asking like what is your go-to source? Because like for me, like regarding this like particular topic, if I have to like, like if I were the participants, for me it's like I don't know, like Instagram, like it's still from like legit sources, like I don't know, BBC or like, NPR, but like I don't like get no, I don't go on like the website to read, like everything is like from Instagram, so
Okay, so not just like the source themselves, but how they get to the source.
like the
Yeah,
medium.
like kind of like the medium. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I had a quick question, not knowing much about the nuances of Operation Metro Surge. Is that like is that the name given to it by like all sides of the political spectrum? Or Andreas is shaking his head. Because I'm like there, I would heavily so two things I would heavily advise is like picking the most neutral name to introduce this topic to participants,
Mhm.
and then also like to like I assume someone's gonna have to tell me if Operation Metro Surge is what like the left has given or like imbued onto this. Is it, it's
It was the administration's name
Yes, this
when they
is the
sent their
official.
agents. Yep. It's the
Mhm.
politically imposed name for it.
okay, okay,
Which plays right into the word choice
yeah.
evaluations. Yeah.
And then the other thing is, I mean, I guess there's like two versions of a flyer you can make for this. Is one calling it like "Give us your thoughts on Operation Metro Surge," or give us your thoughts about like DHS activity in the Twin Cities. But another thing I would advise, this goes more into like the protocol structure or like design, is you might have to be very gentle with certain language because like I could see, I don't know that international students can partake in a lot of studies on campus anyways, but like people who are like fearful of DHS or anything. Hello.
So, do you know where room 12 is? Conference room 12?
Sorry, one second. Sorry about that. Should have closed my door. Anyways, sensitive language because just so you don't want to scare off people who might already be fearful of like DHS and whatnot. I agree that like the timing is probably right for this. Um, but I also wouldn't be surprised if people are still, what's the word, cautious, all things considered.
Yes, I think it's a perfect example of like how the exact words we use do make a difference, which is partly why I think it's like a good topic as well. But that also means that I have a lot of thinking about how I do the initial framing of the study and recruiting of the participants.
Also
Could
just like
you?
thinking about, oh, sorry.
Oh no, I was just wondering if you could go back a slide just to see. I'm trying to get a sense for the goals for these readings.
Oh,
Um,
oh, oh, here. So basically, I am trying now to look at the text features that readers attend to when they make these kind of source position, perspective, and motive
okay,
inferences.
right. So, oh, okay. So you want okay. So my concern with the selection of these texts, and we see this sometimes at ST&D when groups use texts that are on like renewable energy or climate change, is that from undergraduate positions, they tend to get a ceiling effect for people that come in feeling strongly one way. So they have a hard time having equatable groups, I guess, in terms of prior knowledge or sort of their opinions on things. And so I guess my question, and I can see the draw of wanting to use these texts. I guess my concern, having reviewed some of these papers, is that readers' prior knowledge and political orientation or their bias towards the text is going to push their desires to do evaluation in a much stronger way than the things that the texts have. So sometimes you can get a cleaner sort of gauge for what's going on if you pick more neutral topics that students don't have a lot of prior knowledge about and might not have strong opinions going into the text. Or the other way, I mean, if you wanted to sell it, is that we're gonna come into this with just acknowledging that your sample is probably going to be biased in one particular way towards this orientation. Now you might have an equal, I mean, you might have to do some additional recruiting to find, undergraduates that maybe take the view of the group. But I would want to, if I was looking at this from like if it was presented at ST&D or for a journal perspective, I'd want to know, what did the students or what did your participants know already coming into this, and what were the biases that they had? Because I can see how that would overwhelm any sort of like naturalistic evaluation that you might want to get a clean idea of what's going on here.
So I'm wondering like if there's questions that I can then ask as part of like a pre-reading interview to gauge this, because for this third paper, I'm not so much interested in the overall comprehension outcomes as I am mapping the reading strategies to text features, if that makes sense. And so in that respect, like it doesn't matter if there's differences in comprehension outcome overall because of prior knowledge coming in. It seems like the prior knowledge is going to influence the kinds of strategies that they use during the reading.
Potentially, it's an interaction, right, between what the readers bring to it and then what the text has. I mean, you could do a prior knowledge test. You could ask them questions about what they know about, what was called Operation Metro Surge. I mean, you could ask them if they knew, how much. You could ask them to rate their knowledge. You could ask them to rate the strength of their emotional response to that topic, or if they feel like there's all sorts of like pre-reading, questions you could ask before they get to the text.
Emotional response is one too.
I'm like a little bit concerned because it seems like that might have to be two separate things, like a knowledge thing and also a perception thing of like how much do you know about DHS activity and Operation Metro Surge versus like what is your perception, like, whether these actions are good or bad. And unless that literature already exists, I assume you have to do like, what's the word? Measures of like inter-rater reliability on those assessments too,
Mm-hmm.
Not inter-rater reliability, but like, what's the word? Internal validation stuff. Just things to think about.
I think Mike is right that you're unlikely to get neutral students on this. I mean, it could be part of the design to, foreground. This is a hot button topic. How do people source in relation to topics about which they have intense emotional responses? That's another possible way of thinking about it. I wanted to ask some nitty gritty questions. What exactly do you ask participants to do? So, what are the task instructions? And then, very literal minded, what do they actually see on screen? And I'm thinking, I often see these studies where the source is very clearly identified on screen, but a lot of people don't even look at the source, aren't aware of it at all. And we, and good experimenters nicely identify it for them. But I think naturalistic reading, there's just some block of text. And I'm thinking back to Robert Lorch's studies on signaling and the ability of readers to ignore things like titles and subtitles. Well, if they're ignoring subtitles, they're definitely going to ignore a little link source at the bottom. So I'm wondering, how do you give them source information without it going against their habit of maybe not paying attention to source information? I don't know if that makes sense. But...
Yeah, it does. And I think that takes the perspective of very explicit, high salient source information. And part of what I'm trying to focus on is when readers infer source information.
Okay.
And so I think one of the ways they do that is they pay attention to the content more closely. They pay attention to rhetorical strategies, to exact word choice. And so it's actually aligns with the bidirectional model of evaluations, where it's not just that we use source
Right.
cues to evaluate content, but the other way around. And so for that, I'm less worried or concerned about them paying attention to the explicit sources. I'm more interested in to what extent they actually do pick up on like differences in word choice and in the use of emotional language or highly charged language. And are they using those kind of cues to say this source has this kind of perspective or position, and this source is taking more of this perspective or position?
So in that case, this is a study of style more than source.
I mean, I think the big picture argument that I'm making is that the field is really conceptualized source in these explicit terms, but when you think about source as just the context behind the text, that's writing decisions are also provenance of a source. And the words that we choose to use as writers can, I think, be related to the source, the author, when you view them as actual decisions that are made by a person and not just an abstract text style, if that makes sense.
I do,
chewing.
although there. Sorry, am I
No,
speaking
go
over
ahead.
somebody? Andreas, go
No,
ahead.
no, it's fine. I'm chewing on this thing too, sort of like the style, since you're interested in linguistic features, but it looks like you're having people read oral language, or at least somewhat oral language. There's, big differences in terms of the language you use in writing, reading, writing, and literacy versus oral and listening, spoken and listening. The kinds of cues you use, the way you, yeah, word choices, even the sentence structures and all. And you're having people read something that may have been spoken, like it's in the Christiano's case for sure, and I don't know what the other sources go to. And so you're crossing genres, and you're crossing oral and written, and yeah, some of it sounds like you're looking beyond the academic sourcing with the author year at the end, which is again a written feature. So anyway, I don't know. I haven't seen enough, and I missed the beginning, so I may, you know.
Oh, no worries, but that's a good point to bring up the genre difference. And when I choose my materials, um, do I want them to differ in that or to all be the same?
I mean, that would sort of be my first concern, I guess, is if you have people read something that was meant for oral delivery or in the other direction, and if you, I don't know if you can stay in the modality in one or the other direction. But then, yeah, your linguistic features will be closely connected to that. It reminds me of something I've said to my colleagues for many years now, when they keep pushing for allowing more language varieties, more kinds of language to for academic writing, for theses, for whatever, and I'm going like to them, well, so are you ready to have a master's thesis written in African American vernacular English, which is an oral variety, and what are the challenges? So there are big, big hurdles to overcome when you cross between modalities like that and the linguistic features. And
Mhm.
I haven't even landed myself yet for sure whether some of it is just habit of what to expect when you read versus when you listen, or is there, even more behind that because you get in writing you get the dissociation of time and space between author and when you write, between author and the reader, and
Mhm.
then in oral oracy, they're in each other space. They can check in with each other much more directly. So there's all sorts of things going on. Anyway, so just stuff to think about.
Yeah, no, that's really, really helpful because the third text I'm very undecided and unsure about. And I didn't even think about the process of taking something that was originally spoken and having it be presented as a text.
I have two things I'm going to mention. One of them's pretty broad. Oh my God, I think I'm forgetting the other thing. Um, Let me get the first thing out of the way. And this is kind of a note for everyone because Ali and I have talked about this a little bit before. Is that like, and I think you've kind of, all of us have kind of picked up on this throughout the presentation, is that with a study like this, there's going to be like so many things to have to control for, like, in terms of like modality of the source and like whether you want to control like high level features of the source, like should they all have the same expertise or should they have differing expertises, but how does that get entangled with like the information they're giving, all these other things, right? Not to mention that like all other features of the study need to be controlled across participants and whatnot. um oh yeah, the smaller thing I was going to mention is that um I'm sure there's sources that exist, like written sources that exist for like that advocate for whatever bullshit Christy knows spouting nowadays. I'm sure those exist. It's just if you need help looking for those, I can look around. They're not going to be in the friendliest of places places on the internet. That's for sure.
They put out memos that DHS does, so that there's
Cool.
written communication from that side. I know, one evaluative um, thing that a lot of people were doing during Operation Metro Surge was trying to determine if reporters or authors of information were local or not. So if they were Minnesota authors or individuals that had come from outside of the state, like Don Lemon coming in versus Janet Shortall. So I'm not saying you need to control for that, but that is, again, if you're bringing in readers to look at these things and they have a lot of prior knowledge or they have a lot of experience thinking about this stuff and doing these things, again, you might see some biased type of processing there that might it might not reflect the textual features that you're trying to figure out. It might reflect things that they've had been doing or trained themselves to do with these things. So you can control it or just acknowledge that that's something they might be trying to figure out based on, I don't know. I can't. Sometimes there's linguistic features, I guess, of local Minnesotans. I it might be more subtle than I. Andreas is laughing. It's more of a oral tradition, right, Andreas?
Well, no, it's just the Minnesota or the yeah, but yeah, those stereotypes. I don't think that it goes much deeper than that, and I don't know that it would show up in writing necessarily. So, but yeah, it's something to keep in mind in general, just sort of the contextual assumption of knowledge that you put into your writing. Absolutely. So it's a great point. Yeah.
So I'm still trying to understand the research design. Is the how are you going to gauge um, the degree to which they have noticed textual features? Is that in a constructed response to see if they explicitly mention them?
Yes.
And will will that be part of your task instruction? Can you respond with attention to linguistic specifics? Because in general, readers will just paraphrase,
Mhm.
you know, or for the most part, uh, unless you've given them pretty I mean, I'm sure you know this. They can be remarkably disappointing when they pop up in relation to what you thought was the juiciest, most exciting text. They can be very flat. This was about Metro Surge, and the author approved or disapproved, without giving you the stuff that you want. So I'm, or at least based on my experience, that's what I've found, and that they don't give much link. I saw the example earlier of somebody drawing attention to emotional language. I would say that's, yay for that reader. I wouldn't say that's typical. Typically they don't draw much attention to textual features. So I would definitely pilot this to see if you get any response at all, spontaneously, and if you don't, then to figure out ways to prompt that. Either, as you said, you're interested in additional data beyond constructed responses, so I can imagine an eye tracking study that would look at where where you get longer time spent. I don't know if you want to bother with that. That's a huge, a lot of work.
Yeah.
But I'm just trying to think of other ways to get at some of the textual feature stuff, given the likelihood that readers won't spontaneously cough that up.
Yeah, I like the idea of piloting first, and then I've been debating like how explicitly or implicitly to prompt them to think about these cues. So um, yeah, I think figuring out the exact task instructions will be important, but probably need to give that explicit. So that was another thing that I'm still kind of working through is like how exactly do I want to orient them to this, and do I want to, for the constructed response, like do I have them type their thoughts after every sentence or after every paragraph? Like those are the questions that I'm trying to think through as well. So all of your feedback and thoughts have been super, super helpful for that so far, and very much appreciated.
I mean, verbal protocols come to mind if you really want kind of attention to sort of sentence by sentence or even phrase by phrase responses. That would give you probably a good idea, and still some prompting that you'd be sitting there and you could even ask him, "Oh, where did you get that, or what were you inferring that from?" That kind of thing. Um, could you go forward? I was trying to remember what the other two texts were. I was just a little curious. So these are these newspaper kind of
These are, yeah, they're both news articles online. One's more of like educational implications, one's more about economic implications. Um, and they're just the kind of first two texts that came to mind that I had read and made me think about. But I'm not sold on them. I think the thing that I'm looking for is that there's kind of multiple perspectives, whether that's kind of disciplinary perspectives or whether that's like competing political perspectives. Um,
yeah, and I'm just still scanning, are they meant for listening consumption? And it's interesting when you get the back and forth right now on NPR, you get interviews and then they edit
mhm.
them for the readers, so you can actually already get a little bit of a sense of what changes. But then what is the grade level, fifth grade, that they tend to write for in newspapers? You guys, some of you might know that. So you'll have sort of that language level that people will use to begin with, and that's just something else to keep in mind. It's certainly not academic language. Not that you would expect that, but what would that? I don't even know what that exactly looks like. Mike, you might know a little bit more about that. You know what they're really trying to avoid syntactically and even background knowledge wise. So keep just trying to keep in mind, what who the audience was, who it was written for, and what kind of features you would already get or not get to begin with, depending on how they were conceived and what kind of communication they were supposed to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, we say eighth grade
Is it
reading
eighth
level
grade?
for like
Okay.
consent forms and stuff.
All right.
You know,
Okay.
Andreas, do you have recommendations for literature that's kind of identified like linguistic or syntactic structures associated with different genres?
Well, let me think about that.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's a big topic, and um, you know, yeah. Let me think about it. Mike, the stuff we used in Freiburg for the fill in the blank texts. Is there something to be gained for Ollie from that? I'm trying to bring it up, when we had people read through the texts, non-native speakers, and
oh, the
the,
maze,
the maze, yeah, the reading
doing the
maze.
maze tests. Yeah.
Is
So
that a
there's a reading
correct?
test.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's a reading test called a maze that we sometimes use just to gauge people's comprehension ability in a really quick way.
And that was, a certain, it comes in certain grade levels. So, you can actually kind of look through those and see already what is expected and certain, I don't know where they start or if there's the whole range from K through 12, but it was interesting to look through those, and we did it for non-native speakers just to get a sense where they were at, because that's always one of the hardest things to even assume or know if they're advanced or high advanced and all that. So that was our purpose, but that might be a way to start getting a sense of what to expect at different reading levels with that kind of material. And Mike was kind enough to shoot that to me, so I wouldn't even know where to go.
If you send me an email, I can send you information on it. We used it briefly in the one of the IES grants back when I was a grad student. We used it as like a rough test of comprehension because you get a certain amount of time to get through a passage and select the correct word for it. So if you have adult readers, you can just give them a really limited amount of time to get through it. So again, it's a rough estimate.
Kind of
Can be
close, yeah.
handy.
There's filling the blanks or choose between these words, yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just real quick, I want to be mindful of time. I'm not gonna hang out for like another 10, 15 minutes to talk about this more, but Ali, I don't know if you have things to
I've
get
got,
to.
yeah, I've got some more time, but I will not at all be offended if people need to leave. So I've already gotten really great ideas and feedback so far, so I really appreciate it, y'all.
I have to take off, but thank you so much, Allie. It's a real treat to hear about work in progress. And thank you for using us as a resource. It's much
Yeah,
Oh,
appreciated.
well,
yeah,
thank you. Take care.
absolutely, yeah.
Bye,
Thank you.
Ellie. I also
All
have to
right.
head out.
Miranda.
Yeah.
Yeah, no worries.
All right. Good luck. Yeah, no, I'm really curious, and like I said, I've been chewing on this from a different angle, but for a long time, so it will be good to see where you're headed with that. Yeah.
We'll,
So good
we'll
luck.
see. Yeah, thank you.